Baccano is a supernatural gangster series whose English localization is still beloved by many in the anime community to this day, about a decade after it was distributed here in the West. The dub was handled by Tyler Walker, a Texas-based actor, writer, and ADR director who has been working on anime dubs at Funimation for almost 2 decades. And today, I got a chance to sit down with Mr. Walker in order to discuss some of what made the project so special, as well as give us a glimpse into how anime dubs were handled back then compared to how they are now. We hope you enjoy. Good afternoon, Mr. Walker. Thank you so much for joining us on this little podcast of ours to discuss one of, in your words, one of your favorite shows that you worked on.
Yeah.
Baccano, which is almost 20 years old at this point. It's a little crazy.
Yeah.
It's at least over a decade old, and even though it's not as ingrained in modern pop culture as, say, Cowboy Bebop or Fooly Cooly, a lot of people still revere it as one of the best English dubs that the community has ever produced, undoubtedly. A lot of it has to do with its setting, a lot of it has to do with the punchiness of the dialogue, perfect casting across the board, or D, all of the above. So I would love to ask you a few questions regarding how you started working on this project, all the steps that went into sort of making this baby of yours the celebration that it ended up being. So I guess the first question is, what brought you on to be both the ADR director and line producer for the show?
Thanks for talking to me about this. And like I was saying before this, it's really crazy to think that something that I worked on like 11 years ago, it's really affirming to have somebody take an interest and, to see it on, people's best dubs list and all that. It's really cool. I thought it was going to be a good show, but, you never know the lasting legacy of something. And it's really great to see that. As far as getting chosen for the director, I was at the time I was a full-time salaried employee of Funimation as a director. I was going to be working on something. There was about 5 full-time directors back then, and I was going to be working on something. You find out what's coming down the pike, and this show was coming up, and it looked really interesting. Loved gangster movies, and I was a film student, and I'd seen a lot of the genre, and I was really looking forward to something that took place in a particularly American mythology, somewhat uniquely American. So I had more of a kind of a cultural touchstone with that, which you don't always have sometimes with Japanese, or something from a foreign culture. So I showed interest in it. I talked to the producers, and I was, let them know that that's what I wanted to work on. And it just so happened that I was lucky enough to get the gig working on that, because I could have been working on whatever else we were doing at the time. The line producer gig, that was something that we used to have at Funimation, and it's kind of it's from when we had multiple contract directors, really, and you might, for a line producer, you might be a line producer on 3 to 4 shows, but you can't direct all 3 or 4, so you would, kind of hire a director to work under you. You'd work together on something, they would take whatever project, and you would, maybe help cast it, maybe look at the scripts before they came in, check over the mixes, kind of like you're the overlord of the show, the showrunner in a way, as much as we can be.
So how is that different than, say, the ADR director? Aren't they the one that oversees everything?
In some degree, and now it's more like that. But back in the day, you might need it. It was kind of like they had some of us who had more responsibilities, and the director had somewhat limited responsibilities. And being back in those days, being a line producer and director of the same show was just like being like a director with more privileges. When I first started, I did Basilisk, and a lot of those episodes, were done under Mike. Mike McFarlane was the line producer for that one. So I would turn stuff into him, and if I had questions, I'd ask him about it. They would kind of help you out. And before, when I was training, me and Zach Bolton split a couple of shows that were produced by like Colleen or Laura. So it's just kind of like someone who kind of checks over you until you're given the vote of confidence to have more autonomy.
So it's kind of like what we have today with assistant ADR directors.
Yeah.
People will come in to assist direct with shows that maybe a director can't fully dedicate their time to because of whatever reason.
Yeah. And, back like when we were contract employees, we would get paid for like a batch of 6 episodes. And if you had to hire a director, you would basically just kind of pay him yourself. But we don't do that anymore. That was a kind of a headache.
It sounds like it. If that, then what exactly were your responsibilities? So as the line producer, that's another way of saying like you were the go-to person in charge of almost everything regarding this project. Like everyone had to go to you.
I was king of Baccano land.
Because I know that you had a couple of people working on writing and directing episodes for this show. Chuck Huber and Caitlin Glass, I think, also helped out with everything.
Uh-huh.
How much time were you given to work on this overall project when they finally gave you the green light that this was yours?
Well, for back in those days, we had maybe like, I don't know, maybe about a week per episode, and or if you had 6, you'd have like 6 weeks, a month to 2 months, depending on what the volume of lines was per episode, because that's how we break down our time. We count up the lines, and we have kind of a formula of like what constitutes an hour, what should take an hour. So you break things up that way. But in those days we had a little bit more time to do everything, and you would get like 6 or 8 episodes at a time, and you would take them as a big package, whereas now you're pretty much doing 1 episode at a time, unless you somehow have materials early or scripts early, or you're late, I guess. And so things are piling up. But we'd have about 6 to 8 weeks per contract. So sometimes you'd have a lot of time with a certain actor. Like if someone had a lot of lines, you might have that person all day for a couple of days, 3 days, or these longer sessions. Now if you're like a smaller character, you might record for 10 to 15 minutes on a show from week to week. Some of the characters that I do now, that pop up that, that maybe have a line or two, you do those lines, and then next week, if your character has lines, you do those then. But used to, we kind of get it all together.
That is a good point. It's so you guys were still sort of doing things almost on a week-to-week basis back then. Just there was probably less going on back then than there is now. So
yeah, we didn't have the streaming.
Workloads?
We didn't have the streaming platform back then. It was all DVD. So you would have you do something. And I can't remember what time of year. I want to say we were recording Baccano like in the summer of like 2008, and it was released like a year later. Now when you do an episode, you might finish the episode and it's available to watch like 2 days later. So you get like some instant feedback, you see what people like, all that stuff is very beneficial. You can kind of grow your fan base this way, and people sign up for the service, and there's just a lot more of a constant flow. You're responsible for 2 episodes or 1 episode a piece of 2 different shows now, and used to you could kind of focus a little bit more on one show at a time.
Well, also back then, since you guys were dealing with the series when they were finished, you could sort of get the full picture of what was going on.
For the most part.
Did you preview the entire show before you started casting or doing anything?
I believe so. Like I said, this was 11 or so years ago. So I think I'd seen possibly everything but the OVAs at that point, the 3 ending episodes. But then I'd noticed that in one of the commentaries, I guess as soon as I saw Graham Spector, I was thinking Chris Patton. So like I knew that before we were doing everything. So like maybe I saw the first 13, and then I saw the other 3. But you could see, now it's pretty difficult to see 13 episodes of something before you work on it, unless it's like unless it's already out. But most things we do, we buy them, and we work very closely with companies to have them out as quickly as possible. Sometimes even on the same day as the Japanese release.
Right, and a lot of that kind of depends on how soon you get the materials, right?
Yes. And how, if we get episode synopses, if we get a kind of rundown on what's going on, if you get those kind of extra materials. But sometimes, you're working on a show that's like based on a Chinese cell phone game or a card game, and there's not much, you got to see like what they're going to do with the story. But on this project, seems like I had a lot of time to prepare. We had a 6-day audition process, which was pretty unheard of. Usually auditions for like 3 days. But it had such a large cast, and specifically it had a lot of men in it that didn't sound like they were teenagers. But a lot of anime is very youthful characters.
It wasn't a typical anime cast.
No,
a lot of adult men and women.
Yeah,
and little psychopathic children.
Yeah, so we had more time to audition, which it's a little Groundhog Day type thing, because you do the same thing over again. Hey, how you doing? You had time to look over everything? Great. Who do you want to read for? Blah, blah, blah. You kind of do your same song and dance over and over again. I think I auditioned 130 people. So it's a little maddening, but it's such a, the audition process, for me, at least, it's such a good time to kind of think about how you want these characters to come across with someone else's input, and you learn about how the character needs to be portrayed over the course of that audition process. You hear people who raise good points, who have interesting takes on it, and then you also unfortunately hear what doesn't work. So that all kind of comes together in that way.
Well, but you ended up casting most people, because at the end of the day, the cast for the show is just that big. And this is kind of maybe the advantage and disadvantage to the show being told out of order and not really having a linear narrative, jumping around so many different time periods. You don't know who's going to be a big player in the first couple of episodes until you see the whole thing.
Yeah.
Was that something you took into consideration when casting? Okay, this guy's not really going to be that important until we flash 200 years into the past and we see how this all kind of gets started on that boat.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the things, with having, for example, having Chuck Huber play the devil and play the character Ronnie, he was... since he primarily wrote the episodes, I kind of like the idea that, he was in the background, kind of manipulating things, and it tied in with the writer and all that kind of stuff. So, he wasn't a huge role, but he was very important. And then you had some other characters like the Daily Days president, Cole Brown, who we never saw, who was kind of he would be kind of a voice of reason, or try to help understand how everything was put together. Yeah, I mean, if knowing a show, you can strategically cast a lot more effectively, I think. You don't burn somebody on an early episode and they're like, oh man, they're dead. Oh well. Mm-hmm. I've done that a couple of times on a certain show that we did, the show called Phantom, Requiem for the Phantom. We did it kind of broadcast dub style because it was still being released, and I don't know, whatever reason, it didn't get, we did all this stuff, and it didn't get released until 18 months after we'd finished it. So, there goes all that doing it week by week. But, there was a character that Ian Sinclair played that had this, Spanish accent, and I'm like, oh yeah, this is going to be great. And then, we just never see him again. It's well, maybe you could have been somebody else, but that was fun. But with this, you kind of see how people fit in, and they may, I don't know, you make your own, psychological connections with the characters. Like I said, with Chuck, the writer, being, the one pulling the strings, the devil, all that kind of stuff. There was like, it's just one of those like subcasting decisions, I guess.
Well, was that intentional, or was that more like a happy accident?
Oh, that was intentional.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you cast him knowing he was going to write those episodes with the devil in them, or is it
Well,
the other way around?
he wrote a lot of the episodes. Like I think like Eric Vale wrote one, and like Leah wrote one or two, and then Chuck wrote the rest of it because he was pretty in pocket for that. You know, and when you write those, back then we'd have a head writer, and then they would contract out sub writers, and then when you get into the booth, I mean, every script gets changed in the booth, so it's good to have some stuff to work with, and then you see what, like, if you want to add something, or if you want to phrase something a certain way, or if your actor is having trouble with a line. There's all kinds of reasons why you rewrite a line. So it's that collaborative process. But I don't know, that just kind of worked for me with him being the person pulling the strings, and I didn't. I wasn't cut out for that type of part.
That's fair. I remember in the commentary, Chuck was joking around that you put notes still in the script even after he handed them in. Do you remember like what some of those notes were? How many adjustments did you make between script writing and directing? Because directors are able to adjust the script in booth with the actor sometimes, right?
Yeah, I mean, like someone turns in a script and you look over it and you say, like, I don't know, I can't remember anything specifically that I gave him a note on, besides like, would this character say this? Would they know this? Can we punch this up a little bit? We had a list of slang from the 20s and 30s that we would pepper in, and sometimes he would use something, and then sometimes I would use, like, I'd maybe want to use another slang term, or notes really help the creative process because you get people involved and you get another take on it, and sometimes when you're working on something, it's really easy to get into your own head. Having another set of eyes look at something is usually pretty beneficial if they're doing it in good faith, unless they're just like, screw this guy, like I'm gonna, but if someone's making good faith edits, and you're all genuinely working to make the show better, it's a great thing.
And speaking of like that 1930s slang, 1920s slang that you introduced, I know you did a lot of research for this show, like watching a lot of films that, not exactly history pieces or anything, but shows that kind of reflected how intense or over the top that era of time could have been, like The Untouchables.
Yeah.
What other additional research did you do, and did you implement those? Did you work with Chuck in order to create that specific flavor of dialogue that the characters have?
Oh yeah, I mean, we shared like our notes and our thoughts about it, and we did have that, like, this mega list of slang terms, this the definitions and stuff, like you hear people saying like gink, or like some snowed up gunsel, or like these weird kind of things that have fallen out of the parlance these days. They're not in our same vernacular, and I wanted to watch things of that era, like watching like Public Enemy, like the Jimmy Cagney movie, and watching like Little Caesar, another movie from way back then, and a couple of others of the era. Some people, especially like Ladd, right? Like Ladd was very aware of pop culture, and he was aware of his own. He had mythologized himself, and I saw him. Whether this is part of how the character originally, was dreamed up. I saw him as taking mannerisms and vernacular and kind of things from maybe the culture at the time, and he saw himself as this movie star, larger than life gangster, and so some of the stuff he said was a little over the top. So I wanted to be, somewhat familiar with maybe who these characters would be familiar with. And then also watching some very stylized, like Miller's Crossing is a very stylized gangster flick. It's the Coen brothers, so that the dialogue is really, really on point. And then The Untouchables, because that's what Narita, the guy who wrote the original story, said he was influenced by. And just to kind of get in that world, and like gangster movies are very, I love watching them. So it was I was happy to do the research. And I'd seen some of that stuff in film class and in college and stuff.
Oh, of course, it's sort of coming full circle how this is a Japanese product based almost on a glorification of American pop culture, and now you're kind of referencing American pop culture in order to get as close to that that style as possible.
And it's weird because you see a lot, especially because there's all the magic and supernatural stuff, and even like the dominoes they set up, and like in the boat there's like the Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail, or the dragon eating its own tail, and so it's like the show and the way it's like kind of filtered in on itself and back again is kind of that same kind of Ouroboros, like constantly morphing and self-referencing, and so the characters, I thought the characters might have that too. They have some degree of who they are. Like, Isaac and Miri are basically actors, right? They don't know that they're actors, but they are. They're always dressing up and they're doing these outlandish things, and there's the accents and all that stuff, but like Isaac doesn't have an accent because we saw him as maybe more influenced by like thespians or radio announcers and stuff like that. So
which is why he talks like this, like
that's why everything is very announced.
Cows are herbivores, aren't they?
Yep.
I knew it. So that means when you eat beef, you're actually eating both meat and vegetables.
Isaac, you are so smart!
Aren't I?
Of course he's got all the joy and exuberance, but like the characters don't exist in a bubble. They're a product of their time. Them being kind of cultural sponges, I thought was interesting. Especially you have that boxing scene where I call it the boxing scene, where he's just like beating the crap out of that guy, just and then he like does the whole brains. He's like putting his like hand, like his fingers in his brains and stuff. But he's referencing these like famous boxers of the time, and so he was
Dempsey and everything.
Yeah. So he was obviously aware.
Come on, put up your dukes. You think you're Pete Hammond? You're like Jack Dempsey, or maybe Jack Johnson. You've got no technique. Do you even know any of these boxes I'm talking about?
And so when I saw that, I was like, oh, he pays attention to what's going on around him. He's a psychopath. His filter is not reliable, but that's how he sees the world.
Or you could say that a lot of the show kind of focuses on that idea of the unreliable narrator, because Jerry Jules' character
Claire
is a similar way.
Yeah.
Claire Stanfield, right, where he sort of sees it as, I'm the god of this world because no one's really proven him wrong. Because he seems untouchable.
Yeah. He sees himself. He says he's like basically like watching a movie of his life, and he's the only one in the theater, and he's also the star, basically. So even like in some of the more kind of supernatural aspects, or the the weird like kind of crazy rail tracer stuff, like is it real or is it his perception? Can he kind of influence other people's perception by his own perception? How far do his like godlike characteristics go? And it's kind of interesting because there's that grounded American gangster thing, and then there's also the supernatural and the fantastical, which that's just a great combination.
That's true. He almost seems like the middle ground, where they give an explanation as to how he's able to do a lot of things he does. He was like an acrobat.
Well, he's an acrobat, but he's also someone whose view of reality is like absolute, and it all goes back to how he thinks of things. We're not sure if what we're seeing is his thoughts or someone else's perception. So they play with that in a fairly subtle way, I think.
Right, and it's kind of funny that you said everyone sort of has this big personality, because that almost goes back to the very beginning of the show, where Carol and then the man that she's working with, they're trying to document everything that happened, and they're trying to find a focus. So it's like, okay, who exactly is the main character of this story? And the irony is that almost everyone sees themselves as the main character.
Yeah, they're all, everyone's there's the whole saying that everyone's the protagonist in their own story. You're not like a side character to yourself for the most part. And they see themselves as the main character. Someone else could see that. Or is it just a bunch of stuff that happens? Does there have to be any rhyme or reason? Like, so the whole bookend thing with the Gustav and Carol, they're discussing kind of storytelling in general, and they say, well, why is it like this? Oh, because it's fun, it's enjoyable. Is there any deeper meaning? I don't know, maybe.
Might not be.
Who cares? Did you enjoy it? The whole thing is about, it's not about having one absolute thing. It's open to interpretation, like a David Lynch movie or something.
Yeah.
It's did that really happen? Who knows? But it happened in the movie. So
that's a really good point.
So you can go to all these kind of psychological states, these kind of matters of perception and storytelling, who narrates it, whoever's telling the story has control of the story in that way. So it plays with the kind of concept of storytelling, which I think is really interesting. And obviously there was a lot of thought put into everything. So, it's so multifaceted. And I think that's, besides the art direction and the, larger than life characters and all this stuff, I think that meta quality is also has a large part in its durability.
And when it came to casting these characters, was it difficult trying to find people that were able to sort of portray these over-the-top personalities, but in a way so that, everyone has their fan favorites, but you could argue the point is that no one is supposed to outshine anybody else as the main character. So how did that play a part in casting? What specifically were you looking for someone to play in Isaac, a Vlad, a Claire?
Well, some characters are larger than life and some aren't. For example, Misa, his focus is to blend in and to not be noticed, right? Same with Ches. Ches does not have an accent because he does not want to. He wants to be invisible, so he just wants to sound like a sweet boy. But then you have your other characters like Lad and Isaac and Miria that are just larger than life, over the top. And so when I had my audition book, I had a lot of different characters in there, and so people gravitate to the characters that they want to portray. You describe the characters, you have some pictures of them, you have their lines, you have some direction. So the ones who gravitated to the larger than life characters probably wanted to inhabit that and maybe had a large drive to perform. And the accents and stuff, if someone brought that to the table, that's great. They were probably they had more of a likelihood to get a role, and that was listed in the book. We want accent. When I sent my request to our talent coordinator, Tara, and went out to the agencies and stuff, it was if you have accents, it's good to prepare people for that kind of stuff, so they could work on it. They could maybe think of a monologue, or maybe they could watch something, or maybe they could go on their personal experience, because we don't have time to dialect coach everyone. And I may not be the authority on dialects. Just because I'm doing the show doesn't mean I know everything about everything. And when you work with actors, it's all pretend and it's all, showy, but there's a lot of honesty involved. They have to be honest with what they can do or what they think they can do, and you have to be able to trust them, and they have to trust you, and you have to work together in that way. So, that's another reason why we had the long audition process, because I wanted a lot of variety, and there was going to be some people with some European accents, and there's some double casting in there as well, like Jason Liebrecht, him playing Luck, Gandor, and also playing Greto in the 1711 portion of the story. It's a different voice, it has strong Italian accent, and the other one had a more of an East Coast and not a huge accent. Some of the main mains, Firo, Todd Habercorn, and Luck, they had a flavor of an accent, but then you go out further and you see people like Pezzo and Randy, two of the kind of side mafia people. Their accent is way more pronounced, way more over the top, so you don't get fatigued by your main characters, just really chewing it up.
Right, everyone's got a sort of different flavor to them, and it's funny you say that, because one thing people praise about the dub is the accents, how it feels very much like you're watching a movie from the about the 1920s or 1930s, and I'm just going off of what you said. It seems like that was something that you were actively looking for in the casting.
Oh yeah.
To see if people could do that.
It's part of like, I mean, every director thinks of their casting differently, and there's like all these different reasons. Like, there's people you love to work with, there's people you like to work with, there's people who are, who are very professional, there are people who are like really, awe-inspiring, and then, but there are all these, like, you've got a canvas, right, and you're painting with the sound, and so you're building this world of sound, and like, especially with something like this, you have the dialects, so the heavier ones may be more in the periphery and they build your world, and then the people who talk more may not be so over the top. I mean, I guess Ladd's pretty over the top, but in his own way. So you want to have a lot of different types, and I wasn't necessarily as concerned with things being super regional. I wanted it to sound like a gangster movie. I wasn't thinking like, well, this person's from this area of New York, and this person's, he's from Chicago, and there's a little bit of that, but mainly you just kind of want it to sound like that period and like the genre. Like, there's a certain sound of the genre, and then people have their own motivations. Like I was saying, people want to fit in or they want to stand out. I don't know, there's just a lot that goes into it. And then, if you have people that you like to work with and that can do that kind of stuff, it's just a real bonus. And then
it's a win-win.
And then I met a lot of people during the casting process. Like, I'd never met Brian Massey before, who played Ladd. He'd done like a bit at Funimation before. Like, he was like a villager bee or something. But he came in and, he was this, he's a very exuberant, larger-than-life personality. He's got this great gravelly voice. He's very expressive, and he just goes all in on what he does. And so, he was pretty perfect for Ladd. As soon as he read that part, it was kind of his to lose.
And did you have to train him how to do like lip flaps or anything like that, or was he already kind of adept at that point?
Oh, yeah, lip flaps. I mean, some people take to it naturally. People who have usually like musical backgrounds, or maybe have a strong Shakespearean training, because they're more... because meter and timing and stuff is more important. They tend to do pretty well with it, but there's some, and I won't say who and what shows, but there's some people who are not great with flaps, and they have great delivery and they have great voices and stuff like that. And sometimes you just have to keep plugging away, or you have to get take after take, wild takes. Like, you do the line and then you say, okay, again, a little faster, or put a space here, or whatever. But, he got it eventually, I mean, lip flaps, like I said, if the script is tight on those, you're usually in a pretty good position.
Was it challenging to direct Brian? Because, for example, in that boxing scene, he's bouncing and weaving, the mouth's moving, and he kind of sounds like he's out of breath, but he's also excited. What was it like kind of helping him capture that while still maintaining that energy?
Oh, yeah. I mean, people move around a lot. As long as your feet are planted and you don't move your head too much, you're in pretty good shape. But, if you're like, if you're going like this while you're punching, you're like, that's going to give you that sound. There's the scene, you talk about physicality. There's that scene, like, it's later in the show where Isaac and Miria are driving, and they're on that cobblestone road, and the car is like, and they had two different ways of doing it. If you listen to it, their voices start undulating.
All right, steady as she goes.
Hey, Isaac, I just thought of something.
What is it?
We were so lucky to find such a big car parked right out front of the club. Don't you think so?
Yeah, we've never stolen such a big car, but this was a piece of cake, wasn't it, my dear?
We recorded Tatum first, and, I didn't know what to do, really. I didn't, we tried to think of some ways to do it, but he just ended up grabbing his throat and doing it like this the whole time. And then Caitlin did what we call the invisible shake weight, which is you put your hands together and you just shake like this. But, if you don't have that physicality, it sounds like somebody sitting in a room reading something, I think.
Right.
So, some people look like they're, landing planes in the booth. Their arms are everywhere. As long as they don't make noise, they don't have some jangly bracelet or something like that on, or they don't hit the mic, we're usually pretty good.
I do remember in the commentary, you guys were kind of poking fun at Tatum. It kept swinging his arms in booth to sort of match Isaac's theatricality.
Yeah. So he learned how to do that quietly. You could hear it in his body, which comes out, through his voice, but you don't hear it in like his arms flapping around, or he doesn't there was a certain actor that liked to put his hands, lace his fingers behind his head, and then move his arms forward, and it would create like a tunnel. And so, there's all these kind of different ways, or some people will kind of move around on the mic, and you want them to stay, within a good range so they don't sound like they're getting too far away.
That's interesting. And did Caitlin try to mimic Tatum at all? Because her character Miriam just kind of mimics a lot of what Isaac says a lot of the time just in the show, with a similar sort of theatricality, or at least she tries to.
Yeah, usually it was better if he would go first, but sometimes he wouldn't. But we tried to schedule it so, because a lot of hers were like a more exuberant reading of what he would do. So I think we said like Miri is like his understudy in a way, like she's learning the ropes and how to be a theatrical type robber from him. When we recorded the ending narration parts, where Isaac and Miri do their really kind of like silly wordplay, where they try to solve a riddle that doesn't exist with an answer that's not accurate. We'd have the beeps go, with the beeps cue the actor when to say their line, and then Michael would say his line, and I would do my Miri impression, and we'd go back and forth, and that's how we timed those things out. And I remember on the last episode, he's like, Tyler, will you be Miria for me this one last time? Still breaks my heart to think about it. Yeah, I mean, so that was, if the schedule worked, she was able to imitate him. Now, she didn't always do the, crazy gesticulations, but because she didn't watch him record.
Right. She came in at a separate time because, recording's always done one person at a time in separate booths.
And she directed, I don't remember who she directed. I mean, she directed for me while I was on vacation, and Chuck and Ian also came in and helped me out, which was great because Chuck, I remember he had a lot to do with episode 7, is where we meet all the Europeans, and so he was a big help on the dialects there, because he has a lot of formal theater training.
Well, yeah, that's actually an interesting thing about that episode, because their accents and their dialect needs to be different compared to everybody else, because it's so far in the past. They're not even quote-unquote Americans yet, so it'd be weird for them to have an American accent. Were there any other instances where you guys felt like specific thought needed to go into how this character speaks? Because you mentioned some characters like Firo, who does sort of have almost an Italian mafia accent. It's just not as extreme as, say, other characters.
Yeah.
Claire also has a little bit of that.
Yeah.
But Isaac doesn't really have that kind of accent. Misa does, but it's just even more understated because he's trying not to stand out. But Lad's kind of the nephew of one of the bosses in the area, but he doesn't really have that much of an accent.
Oh, he kind of does. I think he's fairly over the top, but it needed to be somewhat grounded in reality. His and his uncle has a little bit of it too, but I think Lad has a little bit more because he's embracing the character of the mobster. Then you have Jacuzzi, who I'd never worked with Joel before then either. That was his first. A lot of people's first bigger roles in this one. But
yeah, I completely forgot Ian Sinclair was in this show.
Yeah. I mean, that was his first. That was his first, major character, and then we went on to do a lot of shows together, and he's been very successful, and he's great and all that. But Joel, he has a pretty big accent. But his voice is so the timbre of his voice almost supplants the accent because it's so high and squeaky and scratchy and.
Just give me a minute. I'm sorry, niece, but can we please just go a little slower? This is killing me.
It stands out in a way you don't really think about the accent so much as his tonality. and you need to sound innocent and childlike and all that kind of stuff. But like I said, they don't exist in a bubble. They some people are more aware of who they are and where they fit in the scenario, Lad or Ches or Miza. They know their place, and they're actively seeking out where they fit into the kind of tapestry of the world that they're in.
That's a very good point that I didn't even think about. So it's less like the accents are meant to convey like a super realistic setting, and more to highlight this is just how the characters see themselves in this world.
I mean, that's part of it. When you think of like a gangster movie, right? Which this is definitely a gangster movie anime. So you have the gangster movie, which is a heightened reality, right? It's real people, it's not animated, but it's a heightened view of reality. And then you make that in a cartoon, and then it kind of rises, the heightened reality or the kind of disconnect from the real world is amplified. So you're doing a cartoon version of a heightened reality kind of thing. So it gives us a little more leeway to go really big, or to kind of, or to be more conscious of what we're doing.
And what about the characters that don't really have accents? Is that sort of an intentional choice? Is there a reason why some characters have accents while others don't?
Yeah, like with, we talked about with Miza, he doesn't want to be he doesn't want anyone to know he's a 250-year-old Italian alchemist. He just wants to be fit in with the people from where he came from. Ches is, you see that he's picked on a lot, you could say, or just mercilessly tortured, and his idea is to blend in as much as possible, which is just to go completely neutral and really kind of up the kind of sweet, wide-eyed boy voice. And Maxie Whitehead voiced him, and it's another one. I hadn't really worked with her, but her voice was just so pure and innocent, and it just sounded so perfect for that kind of character. And then, like we said, with Isaac and Miria, they come from I saw them as being influenced as maybe somewhat transatlantic, but kind of more kind of announcery in that way. So they didn't really have any accent, but they definitely used their voice in a purposeful way. I think it's something that kind of came out of the audition process. Like I said, you can really find out what works for a character, and then how the whole thing comes together. You don't want everyone to sound exactly alike, because the thing is, there are all these different kind of people with different kind of backgrounds coming together. So I can't remember how we discovered that, or how we latched onto that, but it's something that was probably born out from the audition process. And then once you kind of think about things, and you can kind of sit back and put it all together and think about the kind of I was talking about the kind of the sonic canvas you want to paint, how those colors of that canvas come together. It's
a collaborative effort. Everyone sort of contributes, if ever smallly, into how everything ends up sounding.
I mean, you have your in the booth, you've got your director, you've got your engineer. Some engineers are fairly quiet, some people like to be involved, and and then you have the actor, and they bring their thing to the table, and then you have the writer, and they have their whole thing, their perspective. So it's kind of everything comes together, and you have an environment that where everyone is trying to work together to make something more compelling or entertaining, or whatever your angle is.
So there was never a point where anybody needed dialect coaching to be brought in, or
I mean, I probably told some people to watch some movies, but like I said, part of casting and directing is trust. So someone shows you what they can do, a couple lines of dialect, and you're like, that's good. Can you flesh out the character, or oh yeah, I studied that in college, or I played a character like this in something else, and you kind of have to trust on what your actor is willing to try to work on, or what they already know, and if they're honest with you about what they can do, because if not, someone can look foolish, and no one really wants to look foolish unless that's the character.
Nope. Fair. Then what would you say was the most challenging part about directing this show with so many moving parts?
Keeping everyone in the same world and also, having them inhabit this world together, but be able to, have their own separate part and have their own contribution. And also the timeline, it cuts back and forth, and knowing if you're in 1930, you can't really, maybe, they don't know what they know in 1932, so kind of keeping those timelines separate but linear in a way. And the show is, purposefully told in a confusing way, because it's meant to be, it's like the Baccano is like it's like a loud commotion. It's a crazy, just explosion of nonsense, right? Mm-hmm. And the whole storytelling angle that Gustav and Carol talk about, they talk about that as being kind of one of the devices that the storyteller uses. And so, since it's purposefully confusing, it affected us too. So it's like, oh yeah, where are we? When are we? So, all that kind of stuff. And then, kind of grouping up people sounding alike that are together, like the Gandors, and your more Italian people like Bartolo, like Runarada. I saw him as maybe coming from the old country. That was another one that I found during audition. The guy Michael Serecchia, he could do a great Italian accent, and so, hey, there we go.
Dallas Genowat, you know him, right? He is the son of Raymond Genowat, a man you took upon yourself to kill without any instructions from me. He also just happens to be the younger brother of another man you killed on your own named Jeffrey Genowat. You follow?
He was in his 40s or 50s, and he did a great Italian accent, so there we go.
Do you think that would be easier or harder to work around if this dub came out today? Like, if you were given this project, let's say Baccano didn't come out 10 years ago, over 10 years ago. Let's say that it came out this season, you were assigned as the writer and or director. Do you think that it would turn out, obviously it wouldn't turn out the same way, but what kind of product do you think it would be? Do you think it would still work?
Are you suggesting there's the possibility of a non-post Baccano world? We're in a post Baccano timeline, man. No, it's
that's true. Like, who knows how humanity would have progressed if Baccano never came to be. But let's pretend for a second. I know it's a huge hurdle to get, but let's pretend for a second that Baccano came out today, or say a sequel to Baccano.
I think it would be.
God knows people have been asking for that.
Yeah.
If it came out today and Funimation got the rights to it and it was a simuldub, do you think you'd be able to maybe not rein in, but go along with that chaos as well as you managed to back then?
I think it would definitely be more challenging. I don't know. Unless someone had a real big gap between their shows, if anyone would have the same audition length that we had, and to be able to cast such a wide net, and the non-linear nature would be, especially so if we were doing if it was released, if episode 1 was released last week, and then, we're gonna start working on it, tomorrow, I think it would be very challenging, and taking things piecemeal for a show like this that I said is deliberately trying to throw you off. For me, it would be more challenging. Perhaps someone would be really ready for that. But, sometimes you don't know what's going to happen on a show, that you're doing, if you can't get access to the original materials, or the original material is something that's not a narrative. Like, say you're working on something that's just character-based or card game-based. This thing, if someone had the ability to read the source material, which was very hard to get back then, and on some shows it was very hard to get back then. I don't know. It'd be very challenging. I think maybe the nature of doing things so quickly perhaps may have led to, these days may lead to some more safe choices. I'm not sure that, someone who'd never really dubbed would get these big roles and, all this stuff, or you wouldn't even know that it's a big role. Not being able to look at the whole picture is just especially on something like this, it would be a challenge I can't say whether or not it would be a detriment, because some people, people thrive under all kinds of things. Some people like order, they like understanding, and some people love chaos, and they love the quick adaptation and all that kind of stuff. So I can't, it just depends on, if it were me, I'd be freaking out. And I would...
No, that's fair.
So, we did 91 Days, which is in a similar world. I did 91 Days a couple years ago, or 2 years ago. It all runs together. But that was a show that was already... We were able to watch the whole thing and kind of see the way the story played out, even though we did it in a week-to-week schedule. And I didn't really have a lot of time to do auditions, so for that one, I kind of relied on people who I knew, and some people I asked for them to just to record a monologue in a certain dialect and to send it to me so I could see who was better at something, and to verify that they did it. But you'd have to say, like, can you do this accent? What do you feel familiar with this kind of thing? And so you kind of have to source it in that way and not a big open call. I maybe relied on my previous experience more with that show than Baccano, which was like, oh, I never met you. Let's, you're my lead, or which I love doing. But I don't know. It's just a different beast these days.
Would you say that it's getting harder to? We talked about this before, but you see shows like Fire Force, which has the benefit of having the production is going so well on that you guys are getting sort of materials early or with enough time that you can do the same day. And Kyle's casting some unknown people in there, or at least people that haven't really had a main role yet in that show.
Yeah.
And it's understandable that it can be harder to see more shows like that these days because the turnaround is so hard. You can't, how often do you have the time to do a 3 to 6 day audition? We know that was done with some shows like My Hero Academia.
Yeah.
But for example, you're working on Dr. Stone. Did you do an audition? You didn't do an audition process for that, correct?
I don't know because I'm not directing that show. I'm just writing the scripts. So I know he had some people in mind, and he has his way of doing things. I know he'll talk to somebody, and I think they had a quick audition for that. But I was just trying to read the manga and know what happened. And my role in that was different. I know there was a couple of days of auditioning for Fire Force though, and Kyle he wanted to use some people who are new, and I think I can't take credit for that, but I always tried to do that in my shows, and me and Kyle worked together, so I think they may have rubbed off on him a little bit. Even back way back when, doing Black Cat, which was the second show I ever did. Brandon Potter.
Wow.
Brandon Potter had never auditioned before. He never really done voiceover like that. And, he comes in and I cast him as the main dude because I wanted to, I believed in him, and I like the process of kind of discovery. And when people are really kind of new and open, it's really, I know it's a good thing. It's great for a director. They may have their, problems with flaps or, mic technique, but if they can act and they're excited about it, that's great. I say this I've done a couple of shows that were about amnesiacs, right? Phantom Requiem for the Phantom. I'll go back to that, and I did Angels of Death last year, and kind of had prominent amnesiacs, and so I wanted people who had basically no resume in anime because the character doesn't have any memories, and I didn't want the audience to have pre-associations with the actor. It's oh, there's so-and-so playing another character like this, oh, it sounds like they're blah, blah, blah in this show. You just want something that's fresh to where everything is new.
And was that Newton Pittman's first role?
He played character? He played he played this bully kid in Bamboo Blade, and he had a cool voice, and he was a cool guy, and me and him got along really well. So him and Lindsay Seidel both had never really done more than just a couple of lines and something. So they didn't have a big history, and the audience wouldn't know who they were. So that's why I wanted to bring in them specifically. And then there were some hard times, doing the reactions and flat matching and all that kind of stuff. But you just do it until it's right.
That's really all it comes down to sometimes. And what do you think you got the most right with Baccano? What do you think is the thing that makes people keep... You acted surprised when I told you that people still revere it as one of the best dubs to this day, but for a project that you personally feel such an attachment to, what do you think was the thing about it that will probably have it stand the test of time to a lot of people?
I mean, there's a lot of factors in it. One, it's beautifully illustrated or animated, and the subject matter. I think to our audience, it's it's not about someone going to school or losing their virginity or whatever, or being in some place where they only have they can only communicate to the outside world by telegram, or it's something that there's not a lot of representation of
Arguably,
this kind
it
of
still
genre.
doesn't have a lot of representation.
Yeah, well, yeah, but there's not a lot of gangster anime, so it's unique, and it's like I said, it's a thing that resonates with an American audience, and I think everyone was very excited to be a part of it. Some people because they had been in the business and they hadn't done anything like that, and some people because they hadn't been in the business, and so there's a certain joy and exuberance that I think that a lot of the actors brought, and so and I was just lucky enough to be able to play the part of kind of arranging them together. But
And,
it's funny.
and Vinny, don't forget Vinny.
Oh yeah. But there's a I talk about doing Baccano and then doing 91 Days, right? They're kind of Baccano is this fantastical, supernatural gangster thing, and where 91 Days is like a more gritty, revenge show, and very real and all that kind of stuff. And I tried to bring actors from Baccano into it, but if there was an actor from Baccano in it, they would get killed, because I wanted to kind of cut this, draw a parallel and draw a connection to them, and then kind of sever those ties. The whole thing, spoiler alert, the show starts with the main character's parents getting killed. That's in the first 5 minutes. Its parents get killed, and it's so hard and it's so grim that I wanted to cast Caitlin, who played Miria, and J. Michael Tatum, who played Isaac, and these kind of mirthful, characters, and they play his parents, and they get killed instantly, and it's there's going to be no mirth in this show. There's going to be none of that. This is gritty, and so that's that kind of psychological subcasting that makes sense to me, or someone who's really inside it. But yeah, if you hear an actor from Baccano show up, for the most part in 91 Days, they're probably not going to last too long. Joel is in it, Bruce Elliott's in it, Bradley Campbell, some other people from that show, and I just thought it was a chance to bring them back in and then kind of cut the ties and kind of, for me, kind of delineate in another kind of meta kind of way how the two shows differentiate.
That's fair and understandable, actually, because for a lot of people, 91 Days probably filled in the void of us probably never going to get Baccano
Yeah, I was glad to have
again.
it. Yeah, I was glad to have it. I mean, I really wanted that show because of my history with the rare gangster anime genre.
Thank you so much for taking the time to discuss this with us, Mr. Walker. It's
of course
been a very interesting conversation, and a lot of things that me and I'm sure a lot of other people didn't assume about the show, or maybe they got confirmation on what they did assume, but at the end of the day, it's clear that this was something special to you, and thank you so much for all the work that you did, not just on this project, but all the other ones that you've worked on.
Oh, thanks, man. It means a lot. And I know that, seeing some of your other videos and seeing someone who, there's people who think about things in depth about, what we make for a living and what we do for entertainment. There's other things that factor into it rather than just putting the plot forward. There's things, there's concepts to deal with. Stuff like that. It's great to see that some of that stuff that that maybe I thought of or tried to kind of subliminally or explicitly put in there gets picked up on. It's like I said, 11 years later. I've been fortunate enough to be to be in this position for a long time and have a lot of opportunities with the company. It's been 17 years since I started working there, so but this was still an experience that doing Baccano was still an experience that stands out amongst those.
And I'd say that to a lot of us as well. We really appreciate Mr. Walker for taking the time to talk to us about his work. If you like this interview, be sure to follow him on Twitter and maybe check out our other interviews with members of the industry. Special thanks to our patrons for continuing to help us make content like this possible, including Reagan Senpai, Ryan Rodriguez, Seth Phillips, Marissa Lenti, JR Pictures, Spartacus, and Unknown Secret 1000. This has been the Cartoon Cipher, and until next time.